The first thing I understood after 4 days of medically induced sleep wasn't the beeping of the monitor beside my bed. It was a folded scrap of paper pressed into my palm by a nurse who wouldn't meet my eyes, and 11 words that told me my own family had paid to keep me from waking up. Your family paid me to keep you under. The reversal drug already worked. Pretend it didn't. I want you to sit with that sentence the way I had to sit with it. Flat on my back, tubes in my arm, unable to move my face into anything but the same slack, drugged expression I'd been wearing for 4 days. Because the moment I understood those words, I understood something else too. I wasn't just recovering from a heart attack. I was lying in the middle of a plan, and the people running it were people who'd kissed me goodnight for 9 years. Welcome back. Pour your coffee, settle in, because in these stories, the truth always finds a way to wake up, even when everyone in the room is praying it stays asleep. Subscribe so you never miss what happens next. 6 days earlier, I was Gerald Whitlock. Everyone in Danvers, Ohio just called me Jerry. I was 61 years old, and I owned Whitlock Steel Fabrication, a company I built from a single rented welding rig in my father-in-law's barn into a plant that employed 85 people and supplied structural steel to half the bridge and infrastructure projects in 3 counties. 6 days earlier, I had a wife, a business partner I trusted like a brother, and a heart that I thought, right up until the moment it didn't, was strong enough to carry all of it. I collapsed on the shop floor at 4:40 in the afternoon, halfway through walking a client through a load-bearing spec sheet. I remember the pain arriving like a fist, closing around my chest from the inside. I remember Preston, my son, catching me before my head hit the concrete. I remember thinking, with the strange clarity that shows up right before everything goes dark, that I had a meeting with Walt Higgins the next morning I couldn't miss. I didn't make that meeting. I didn't make any meetings for a long time. They put me under on purpose. Dr. Roland Ashby, the cardiologist who met my ambulance, explained it to Renata in the hallway while I was still on the gurney. A medically induced sedation to protect my heart from the stress of a full arrhythmia episode. 48 hours, maybe 72. Standard protocol. Nothing to be alarmed about. Renata nodded along like she was memorizing a grocery list. I know that because Nora Kessler, the night nurse, told me all of it later, word for word, sitting in a chair beside my bed with her voice shaking. The 48 hours became 4 days. On the 3rd day, according to the chart, they administered the reversal drug that was supposed to bring me back toward consciousness. According to the chart, it failed to produce a response. According to the chart, Dr. Ashby recommended extending sedation and beginning a cognitive assessment protocol once I did wake, given the, quote, uncertain trajectory of recovery. None of that was true. The reversal drug worked exactly the way it was supposed to. I came up out of the dark like a man surfacing from deep water, groggy but present, aware of light and sound and the shape of my own name floating somewhere just out of reach. And standing over me, close enough that I could smell her perfume before I could open my eyes, was my wife, telling Dr. Ashby that whatever it took, however long it took, she needed him to be sure. She needed everyone to be sure. I didn't know yet what she needed to be sure of. I found out 4 hours later, from a nurse with trembling hands and a folded scrap of paper. Nora Kessler had been on the floor 11 years. She told me later she'd never once in that career done what she did that night, and she hoped to God she never had to do it again. She'd been approached by wife 2 days into my sedation, in the hospital cafeteria, over a cup of coffee Renata bought for her, like they were old friends catching up. Renata explained that our family was going through, quote, a difficult and sensitive legal situation, and that it would be enormously helpful and enormously appreciated if Nora could make sure my chart reflected a slower recovery timeline than what actually occurred. There would be compensation. Renata used that word, compensation. Like Nora was a contractor being asked to push back a delivery date, Nora took the money, $800, cash, folded into a hospital gift shop bag. She told me she took it because her daughter needed braces and because Renata made it sound so small, so administrative, so far from anything that could hurt anyone. And then she watched me wake up. She watched me come back into my own eyes, confused and frightened and trying to make my mouth work, and she watched my wife walk out into the hallway and tell my cardiologist that the drug hadn't taken, that I was still unresponsive, that we needed to talk about what came next. That's when Nora understood what compensation actually meant. It meant erasing 4 days of my life and replacing them with a lie large enough to justify whatever came after it. She came back into my room a little after midnight, when the hall was quiet and the monitors were the only thing making noise. She checked my vitals the way she'd checked them 100 times that week. And while she did it, she slid a folded piece of paper into my palm and pressed my fingers closed around it with hers. "Pretend," she whispered. "Whatever you're feeling right now, however awake you are, pretend you're not. Not yet. Not until you understand what they're planning. I don't know all of it. I only know enough to know you're not safe waking up all the way in this room." I want to tell you I understood immediately that some sharp, clear-eyed version of myself snapped into place and started calculating. That's not what happened. What happened is I lay there for 3 hours, turning that paper over and over in my hand under the blanket, my heart pounding harder than it had any business pounding for a man 4 days out from a cardiac event, and I let my face stay slack, and I let my eyes stay half open and unfocused, and I became, for the first time in my adult life, a man pretending to be less than he was. It is a strange thing, playing possum in your own hospital bed while your wife sits in the chair across the room scrolling through her phone. I studied her the way I'd never studied her in 9 years of marriage. The particular way she checked the door before she took calls in the hallway. The way her voice changed, brightened, went soft and worried and performative whenever a doctor walked in, and went flat and businesslike the second the door closed again. I'd married a woman I loved. I was starting to understand I'd never actually met her. Douglas Pierce came by on the second morning after I woke, before I let anyone know I'd woken. Douglas had been my business partner for 18 years, my best man, the closest thing I had to a brother since my own brother died young. He sat in the chair Renata had vacated for coffee, and he talked to my unconscious body the way people do, filling silence because silence is unbearable. He talked about the plant, about a shipment delay, about how the board was getting nervous without clear leadership. And then, almost as an afterthought, almost gently, he said something that turned my blood to ice water. "Don't worry about the numbers, Jerry. Ren and I have got it handled. By the time you're back on your feet, however that looks, it'll all be clean. You won't have to think about any of it." Ren and I. Not Ren and Walt, my lawyer of 20 years. Not Ren and the board. Ren and I, Douglas Pierce and my wife, quietly agreeing to handle something they didn't want me thinking about, while I lay 4 feet away, listening to every word with my eyes half open and my face arranged into nothing at all. I didn't move. I didn't make a sound. I let him finish his coffee and leave, and I lay there in the dark counting the ways a man could disappear from his own life without ever actually dying. The days that followed taught me to read my own household the way I used to read a bad set of blueprints, looking for the load-bearing lie holding the whole structure up. Preston came every single day. My son, 29 years old, a junior structural engineer at my own plant, the only person who talked to me like I was actually in the room instead of a problem to be managed. He'd sit and read me the sports section or talk through a fabrication issue on the Hollis Bridge job like I could weigh in. And every single time, without fail, Renata found a reason to shorten his visit. A doctor needed the room. The specialist was coming through. Visiting hours were about to close, even when they weren't. I noticed the dog first. Bruiser, my old chocolate lab, had slept at the foot of my bed for 11 years. On day 6, Preston mentioned in the easy, offhand way you mention something that hasn't occurred to you as strange yet, that Bruiser had gone to stay with Renata's sister because the house was, quote, too much to manage right now. I felt something in my chest that had nothing to do with my heart condition. I noticed the locks next. Walt Higgins, my lawyer, my friend since college, the man who drafted every document that mattered in my adult life, stopped coming. When I finally had the chance to ask Preston why, in the careful, half-mumbled way I was allowing myself to ask anything, my son told me Renata had let Walt go. Conflict of interest, she'd said. Given the sensitive nature of my care and my affairs, she'd retained a new firm, a firm Douglas recommended. I noticed the appointment. It came back to me slowly, in pieces, the way things do when your brain is still climbing out of a chemical fog. The morning I collapsed, I'd been on my way to meet Walt at 9 a.m. to sign two documents. The first was a revised prenuptial addendum protecting the company from being touched in a divorce, something I'd been putting off for years out of misplaced sentiment and finally decided to handle. After I found the hotel charge on our joint statement, a charge for a room 40 minutes from Danvers on a night, Renata told me she was visiting her sister. The second document was an amended power of attorney, removing Renata as my sole healthcare and financial proxy and naming Walt and Preston jointly instead, because a man doesn't stay in business 20 years without learning that trust is a structure, and structures need more than one support beam. I never made that meeting, and now I understood, with a clarity that felt like ice water down my spine, exactly why someone might have wanted to make sure I never did. Sal Ricci lived 2 houses down from me, a retired county sheriff's deputy who'd spent 30 years reading liars for a living, and now spent his retirement reading the newspaper on his porch and complaining about the Danvers City Council. Sal came to visit on day 9, sat by my bed telling me about a pothole dispute on Miller Street like it was the crime of the century, and somewhere in the middle of it, he leaned in close and lowered his voice. "Your boy Preston's been getting quieter every time I see him at the house," Sal said. "And that new lawyer your wife hired, the one with the office out by the interstate. I ran a background on him before I retired. Different case. Different year. Man's had 2 bar complaints for pushing guardianship cases through fast on thin medical documentation. You want my honest opinion, Jerry, and I know you can't say much right now, but something about this whole situation smells like a house fire. Nobody's called in yet." I looked at Sal, and I let my eyes hold his just a half second longer than a man in a coma-adjacent fog should be able to manage. Just long enough for him to understand. His eyebrows went up barely, and then he sat back in his chair and started talking about the pothole again, loud enough for anyone listening at the door to hear nothing unusual at all. That was the moment I stopped being a patient and started being something else. A man collecting evidence from inside his own hospital bed, one visit, one whispered mistake, one folded piece of paper at a time. I found out what Douglas meant by clean on day 11. Nora had started smuggling me small things during her overnight shifts, a legal pad, a pen, the newspaper's business section, folded small enough to hide under my blanket. I read, with my hands shaking, that Whitlock Steel Fabrication had entered, quote, preliminary conversations with Prairie Beacon Industrial Group regarding a strategic asset sale, pending resolution of, quote, ownership and leadership matters currently under family review. They weren't just planning to control the company while I recovered. They were planning to sell it. Sell the 85 jobs, the 31 years of my life. The plant with my father's old welding rig still bolted to a wall in the break room like a museum piece out from under me, while I lay in a bed with a chart that said I might never wake up all the way. I wrote 3 words on that legal pad that night in handwriting so shaky it barely looked like mine, not while I'm breathing. Then I tucked the pad back under my mattress, closed my eyes, and let Renata walk back into the room and tell the night doctor, in that same warm, worried, performative voice, that she was starting to lose hope her husband would ever really come back to her. She had no idea how wrong and how right that sentence was about to become. Douglas started coming by the house before I was even discharged, which I only knew because Preston mentioned it in the flat, careful voice he'd developed over those 2 weeks. The voice of a young man learning to report facts without letting his face show what he thought of them. Douglas had moved a folding table into my study. My study, with my father's drafting tool still hanging on the wall, and 31 years of contracts in the filing cabinets. He said he needed the space to, quote, keep the business running smoothly during a difficult transition. Renata told Preston it was temporary. Preston told me, in a whisper, leaning close to my ear while pretending to adjust my pillow, that Douglas had been there 4 nights that week, and twice he hadn't left until morning. I filed that away with everything else. A man learns, lying still long enough, that rage is a fuel you have to ration. Burn it all at once, and you've got nothing left when the moment actually calls for it. The discharge happened on day 14, and it happened exactly the way I expected it would, which is to say, it happened as a formality designed to look like a mercy. Dr. Ashby stood at the foot of my bed with a clipboard and a face arranged into careful practiced compassion, and he explained to Renata, in front of me, in the tone doctors use when they've decided, the patient in the room doesn't need to be spoken to directly anymore, that my cognitive presentation remained, quote, inconsistent, that home care with professional support would be advisable, and that given the complexity of my affairs, a formal capacity evaluation might be prudent within the next 30 days, quote, purely to protect Mr. Whitlock's own interests, purely to protect my own interests. I lay there absorbing that sentence the way you absorb a blow you saw coming and still couldn't brace for. They weren't just going to run the company without me. They were going to make it legal. A capacity evaluation, a friendly judge, a guardianship order, and Renata wouldn't need my signature on anything ever again. She'd be my signature. I let my eyes drift unfocused toward the window. I let my hand, when Renata took it in the elevator down to the car, stay limp and unresponsive in hers. I have never in my life worked harder at doing nothing. They took me home to a house that no longer entirely felt like mine. Bruiser was still gone. Half the furniture in my study had been rearranged to accommodate Douglas's folding table, which had somehow become a permanent desk with 2 monitors and a printer. A home health aide named Denise arrived on a rotating schedule, a perfectly pleasant woman who, I came to understand within the first week, reported every detail of my behavior directly to Renata in a shared notes app on her phone. I watched her type once, when she thought I was dozing in my recliner. PT appeared to track conversation in kitchen for several minutes. Will monitor. They were building a file on me. Every lucid moment I let slip was becoming a data point in the wrong direction, evidence against the story they needed the judge to believe. So I stopped slipping. I became, over the course of that first week home, the single most convincing patient Danvers, Ohio had ever produced. I dropped spoons. I asked what day it was and forgot the answer 30 seconds later. I called Denise by the wrong name, twice, on purpose, and watched her write it down with something that looked almost like satisfaction. Underneath all of it, I was working harder than I'd worked in years. Sal Ricci became my first real ally. Because Sal was the one person in Danvers who could walk into my house without raising suspicion. An old friend checking in on a sick neighbor, bringing a casserole, staying to watch a ballgame. What Sal actually did every visit was slip me printouts folded inside the sports section, property records, a skip trace on the new lawyer, a man named Curtis Rand, whose firm had filed 11 guardianship petitions in the past 4 years, 9 of them uncontested, all 9 resulting in the petitioner gaining control of assets worth, in total, north of $30 million. Sal had a friend in the county recorder's office who owed him a favor from 20 years back. That favor turned into the first hard thread I had to pull. The second thread came from Nora, who by then had crossed a line she couldn't uncross, and seemed to have decided the only way through it was straight ahead. She told me, on one of her days off, sitting in my kitchen with Denise conveniently sent out for groceries, that she'd looked into Dr. Ashby's billing history out of nothing but a bad feeling. Ashby had performed, over the past 3 years, an unusual number of extended sedation protocols on patients over 60, with what the records called, in the sterile language of insurance coding, complex family estate considerations. Every single one of those patients had ended up under a court-appointed guardian within 4 months of discharge. Every single guardian had retained the same law firm, Curtis Rand's firm. I asked her why she was risking her license to tell me this. She looked at her hands for a long moment before she answered. My father went through something like this, she said. Different family, different doctor, same shape. Nobody believed him either, not until it was too late to matter. I took Renata's money because I needed it, and I've hated myself every day since. And I am done being the reason this happens to one more person. That was the moment Nora Kessler stopped being a nurse with a guilty conscience and became something closer to family. She had no blood tie to me, no legal reason to be in that kitchen risking her career. She stayed anyway, because some people's decency runs deeper than their fear, and because grief, once you've survived it, makes you fiercely unwilling to watch it happen twice. The third thread came from Preston, and it was the one that nearly broke me. He came to the house on a Sunday when Renata was at her sister's, and Douglas was, according to the shared notes app I'd learned to check on Denise's unattended phone, quote, handling logistics at the plant. Preston sat across from me at the kitchen table, and for the first time in 2 weeks, I let my eyes stay sharp and present the entire visit. He noticed within 30 seconds his face did something complicated, relief and fear and hope all arriving at once. "Dad," he whispered, you've been, since day 2, I said, and watching him absorb that, watching 2 weeks of careful, controlled grief crack open on my son's face, was the closest I came to losing my composure the entire ordeal. "I need you to keep doing exactly what you've been doing. Keep showing up, keep saying nothing, and I need you to tell me everything you've heard at the plant, no matter how small it seems." What he told me filled in the last piece I needed. The Prairie Beacon deal wasn't just a sale. It was a fire sale, structured to close in 90 days at 60 cents on the dollar of what Whitlock Steel was actually worth, with a consulting fee built into the contract, payable to a shell entity called Bearline Advisory for, quote, transition services. Preston had pulled the entity registration out of curiosity one slow afternoon in the plant's back office. Bearline Advisory had 2 listed officers, Douglas Pierce and Curtis Rand. Douglas wasn't just protecting Renata's interests. Douglas was engineering the entire collapse for a cut of the sale, dressed up as a consulting fee, funneled through the same law firm that specialized in declaring elderly business owners incompetent right on schedule. I asked Preston very quietly whether he thought his mother, Renata, was his stepmother, not his mother, but he'd never once made that distinction unkindly until that afternoon. Whether he thought she knew the full shape of it, or whether she thought she was only fighting for a fair share of a marriage she suspected was already over. "I don't know," Preston said. "I want to believe there's a difference. I don't know if there is anymore. I didn't know either. Not yet." Finding out was going to take one more piece of information, the one Sal Ricci brought me 2 days later, sitting on my back porch with a beer he wasn't drinking and a folder he wasn't in any hurry to open. "Gary," he said, "before I show you this, I want you to remember you asked me to look at everything, every angle, no matter where it led. Show me, Sal." He slid a single page across the table. It was a pharmacy record, obtained through a source Sal wouldn't name, and I chose not to ask about, showing a refill history for my blood pressure medication over the 6 months before my collapse. Someone had adjusted the dosage twice during that window, without a corresponding note in Dr. Ashby's file, without my knowledge, without a single conversation with me about why my prescription had changed. The adjustments were subtle, the kind that over months could push a stressed, overworked 61-year-old heart from managed risk into a coin flip. "I'm not a doctor," Sal said, watching my face, "but I know a controlled variable when I see one being tampered with. Somebody had access to your medication for 6 months before that heart attack, Jerry. Somebody with a reason to want your heart exactly as fragile as it needed to be, right around the time a big decision was coming due." I sat on that porch a long time, the beer going warm in my hand, looking at a piece of paper that suggested my heart attack hadn't been an accident of stress and bad genetics at all. It had been a variable, adjusted, managed, the same word Dr. Ashby used about my chart, about my capacity, about my entire remaining life. I didn't know it yet, not with certainty, not until much later. But sitting on that porch, I understood the shape of the whole thing for the first time. This wasn't a family panicking after a health scare and making some ugly, understandable, forgivable decisions under pressure. This was a plan built months in advance, with a doctor, a lawyer, a business partner, and a dosage adjustment, all pointing the same direction, toward a version of Gerald Whitlock who couldn't sign his name, couldn't run his company, and couldn't ask a single question about where 31 years of his life had gone. "I want everything," I told Sal. "Every record, every filing, every dollar that's moved through Bearline Advisory since the day it was registered. And I want it quiet. They think I'm a man dropping spoons and forgetting what day it is." I intend to stay that man right up until the moment it matters most that I'm not. Sal looked at me for a long moment, then reached across the table and shook my hand like we were closing a deal instead of opening a war. You know, he said, in 30 years on the job, I put away plenty of men who thought they were smarter than the system. Never once met a man planning to beat it by playing dead. I like your odds better than theirs. I didn't know it yet, but I was going to need every ounce of that patience because the capacity hearing had already been scheduled, and Curtis Rand had already filed the petition, and the date on the courthouse calendar was closer than any of them realized I knew. Walt Higgins came back into my life on a Tuesday night, 61 years old, driving his own car with the headlights off the last quarter mile, so nobody at the house would notice, parking 3 streets over and walking the rest of the way in a coat that made him look more like a man out for exercise than a lawyer, smuggled in to save his oldest friend's company. Sal Ricci brought him in through the back door while Denise was on her dinner break, and Renata was, according to the Notes app, quote, handling vendor calls at the plant, which by then I understood meant she was somewhere with Douglas. Walt sat across from me at the kitchen table and looked at me for a long moment before he said a word, the way old friends do when they're recalibrating everything they thought they knew about a situation. They told me you weren't tracking conversations, he said finally. I've gotten very good at not tracking conversations, I said, right up until I decide I'm going to. We worked at that kitchen table for 3 weeks, in pieces, in stolen hours, with Nora feeding us hospital records, Sal feeding us county filings, and Preston feeding us everything the walls of Whitlock Steel would let him overhear. Walt brought in a forensic accountant he trusted, a quiet, exacting woman named Deborah Okafor, who had spent a career pulling apart shell companies for the state attorney general's office before going private. It took her 9 days to trace the full architecture of Bearline Advisory, the consulting fee built into the Prairie Beacon sale, the second, smaller account that had been paying Dr. Ashby a monthly retainer disguised as a research grant, and the third account, the one that made my hands shake when Deborah slid the printout across the table, showing a series of payments from Douglas Pierce personally to a compounding pharmacy, 2 counties over, the same pharmacy that had filled 2 unauthorized medication adjustments under my name. Douglas hadn't just planned to profit from my incapacity. He had engineered it. I need you to understand something before we go further. Walt said to me that night, closing the folder gently, the way you close a book you wish you'd never had to read. What Deborah's found, if it's what it looks like, isn't guardianship fraud anymore. It's attempted murder, or close enough to it that a prosecutor won't have any trouble sleeping at night, pursuing it that way. I thought about Douglas Pierce standing at my hospital bed, talking to my unconscious body about numbers being handled, about how I wouldn't have to think about any of it. I thought about 18 years of trusting a man with the keys to everything I'd built. I felt something in my chest that had nothing to do with my heart condition, and everything to do with the particular grief of learning a brother was never really a brother at all. Then we do it right, I said. Not out of anger. Out of the truth laid out so clean nobody in that courtroom can look away from it. The capacity hearing was scheduled for a Thursday morning in the Danvers County Courthouse, a squat brick building I'd walked past 10,000 times and never once expected to matter this much. Curtis Rand had built his petition on Denise's careful notes, on Dr. Ashby's chart, on 2 months of a man appearing to drop spoons and forget names and lose track of conversations in his own kitchen. He had, according to Walt, requested an expedited ruling, citing my declining condition and the urgent need to protect my financial interests. He had no idea he was about to walk into a room where the man he was describing had spent 2 months building a case against him, with the patience of someone who'd spent 31 years learning that a structure only fails where you didn't reinforce it. I wore a suit for the first time since my collapse. Renata sat 2 rows ahead of me in the gallery, next to Douglas, both of them wearing the careful, sorrowful expressions of people who'd rehearsed grief in a mirror. Dr. Ashby sat with Curtis Rand at counsel's table, ready to testify to my inconsistent presentation and uncertain trajectory of recovery. Nobody in that room, except Walt and Sal and Preston and Nora, sitting together in the back row like a small, quiet army, knew that the man being wheeled in, because I let them wheel me in one last performance, was about to stand up on his own 2 feet. Dr. Ashby testified first. He was smooth, credentialed, sympathetic. He described my presentation in careful clinical language, cognitive fog, inconsistent tracking, a trajectory that concerned him deeply as a physician who, quote, cared about this family. Curtis Rand asked him whether, in his professional opinion, I was currently capable of managing my own financial and medical affairs. In my professional opinion, Dr. Ashby said, no, I don't believe Mr. Whitlock is. That was when I stood up. I want to tell you the room went silent, but silence isn't quite the word for it. It was more like the room forgot how to breathe all at once. Renata's face went through 3 expressions in under 2 seconds. Confusion, then dawning horror, then something that looked almost like relief, like a woman finally allowed to stop performing a role she'd grown to hate. Douglas didn't move at all, which told me more about him than anything he could have said. Your Honor, I said, and my voice came out steadier than I expected. Steady enough that the court reporter later told Walt it was the clearest. Most composed testimony she'd typed in 14 years on the job. My name is Gerald Whitlock, and I have been fully capable of managing my own affairs for approximately 2 months. I have simply been allowing certain people in this room to believe otherwise, because the alternative was letting them finish what they started before I understood the full shape of it. What followed took the better part of 4 hours. Walt entered Deborah's forensic accounting into evidence, the full architecture of Bearline Advisory laid out on a screen for the judge, the payments to Dr. Ashby's research grant that was never a research grant, the compounding pharmacy records with Douglas Pierce's personal signature authorizing changes to a prescription that wasn't his to touch. Nora testified about the $800 in a gift shop bag and the note she'd pressed into my hand, her voice shaking but her spine straight, a woman finally putting down a weight she'd carried alone for 2 months. Sal testified about Curtis Rand's history of expedited, uncontested guardianship petitions, 9 of them, $30 million, a pattern too consistent to be coincidence. And then I played the recording. I hadn't mentioned the recorder pen to anyone. Not even Walt, not until that morning. It had been a gift from Preston 3 Christmases ago. A novelty item, a working pen with a hidden recording function he'd bought as a joke about how many meetings I complained about sitting through. I'd started carrying it clipped inside my robe the day after Nora slipped me that note, and I'd kept it running through every visit, every whispered hallway conversation, every moment someone stood over my supposedly unconscious body and said something they never expected to be heard. The recording that mattered most was 14 seconds long. Douglas Pierce's voice, clear as anything, standing at my bedside on the second morning after I secretly woke. Don't worry about the numbers, Jerry. Ren and I have got it handled. By the time you're back on your feet, however that looks, it'll all be clean. You won't have to think about any of it. The judge listened to it twice. The second time, I watched Renata's hands go still in her lap, watched something in her face crack open the way ice cracks on a pond, all at once, no warning. When it was her turn to speak, Curtis Rand tried to stop her. She waved him off. I knew about the sale, she said, her voice barely above a whisper. I knew about wanting control while Jerry recovered. God forgive me, I even knew about paying the nurse, and I have to live with that for the rest of my life. But I swear to you, Your Honor, I swear to my husband, I did not know about the medication. I did not know what Douglas did to his heart. If I'd known that, I would never. She stopped. She looked at Douglas, and whatever she saw in his face in that moment finished the sentence, for her better than words could have. The judge dismissed the guardianship petition in full, ordered an immediate referral to the county prosecutor's office regarding the medication tampering and the financial fraud, and revoked Curtis Rand's authorization to practice before that court pending a state bar investigation. Dr. Ashby's medical license was suspended within the month, and the state medical board's review of his other, quote, complex family estate consideration patients eventually uncovered 2 more elderly business owners who'd been caught in the same pattern, both of whom, thanks to the trail my case exposed, got their capacity restored and their assets returned before it was too late. Douglas Pierce was charged with financial fraud, conspiracy, and reckless endangerment for the medication tampering, a charge that carried the real, documented possibility of prison time. He was removed from Whitlock Steel Fabrication that same afternoon, his 18 years of partnership dissolved by a company he no longer had any legal claim to. I didn't go looking for him afterward. I didn't need to see his face to understand what he'd lost. I'd already lived that particular education myself, 4 days at a time, in a hospital bed, learning exactly how much of your life can be taken from you by someone who used to sit across the table and call himself your brother. The private reckoning, the one that mattered more than any courtroom, happened 3 nights later, in my own kitchen, where it had all started to unravel weeks earlier, over folded printouts and cold coffee. Renata came to the house to collect the last of her things. I let her. We sat at the table for a long time before either of us said anything. I'm not going to pretend the divorce papers Walt drew up are anything other than what they are, she said finally. I know I don't get the company. I know I probably don't deserve to ask you for anything ever again. I just need you to know the affair started because I was lonely and stupid, and it turned into something I couldn't stop. And by the time I understood what Douglas actually was, I was already in too deep to walk away without losing everything myself. That's not an excuse. I know it's not an excuse. No, I said. It isn't. I loved you, Jerry. Before all of this. I know that doesn't mean much now. I thought about the woman who'd sat in that chair across from my hospital bed, checking the door before every phone call, warm and worried in front of the doctors and flat and businesslike the second they left. I thought about 9 years, and about the particular grief of realizing you'd spent them married to someone you never fully knew. I believe you loved me once, I said. I even believe some part of you still does, in whatever shape love takes after it's been through what ours went through. But love isn't the thing that was on trial in that courtroom, Renata. Trust was. And you can't build a life, or rebuild one, on love alone if the trust underneath it is gone. She left that night, and I didn't hear from her again for the better part of a year. The company survived. That mattered more to me, in the end, than any single reckoning. Whitlock Steel Fabrication didn't sell to Prairie Beacon, didn't lose a single one of its 85 jobs, and within 6 months had brought in more contract work than any year in its history. In part because the story of what happened to me spread through the industry the way stories do, and clients wanted to work with a man who'd fought that hard to keep his name on the door. I made Preston a full partner that spring, not because he was my son, but because he'd earned it the only way that ever actually counts, by showing up every single day for 2 months when showing up cost him something, when his stepmother, though he never called her that again after the hearing, actively discouraged it, when he had every reason in the world to believe the man in that bed might never fully come back. Trust. I told him the day I signed the partnership papers. Isn't a single grand gesture. It's 1,000 small ones, repeated on the days nobody's watching to give you credit for it. He'd banked more of those than anyone else in my life. And he'd banked them without ever once asking for anything in return. Nora Kessler I hired myself 6 months later, once the state board had finished its review and cleared her of anything beyond the initial lapse she'd already confessed to under oath. I built a small on-site wellness clinic at the plant, mostly to look after 85 welders and fabricators who spent their days doing hard, dangerous work, and I asked her to run it. She cried when I offered and told me her father, years ago, had lost his hardware store to a scheme nearly identical to the one that almost cost me everything, and that some part of her had spent a decade waiting for a chance to make that mean something. I told her it already had. Sal Ricci got nothing from me but my genuine, ongoing friendship and a standing invitation to Sunday dinner, which he took me up on more often than not, usually with a new complaint about the Danvers City Council, and once in a while, a quiet, unshowy pride in his voice, when he talked about the case the way a man talks about work he'd a long time ago, and never expected anyone to thank him for. I kept my father's pocket watch on my desk through all of it, the one Renata had once suggested gently, that we sell along with some of the other, quote, unnecessary old things cluttering the house during a lean year early in our marriage. I'd refused then without fully understanding why. I understood now. It had been my father's, engraved on the back with his initials and the date he opened the barn where I later built my first welding rig, and it had sat through every version of my life, including the 2 months I spent pretending not to be alive in my own house. The week Preston made partner, I had it engraved a second time, his initials added beneath my father's, and gave it to him across that same kitchen table where everything had started to come apart and then, slowly, come back together. It was his daughter, my granddaughter Wren, 6 years old, who said the thing that ended up staying with me longer than anything the lawyers or the judge or even Sal ever managed to say. She was sitting on my lap on the porch one evening that summer, a year almost to the day since the collapse, and she asked me, with the perfect unguarded curiosity only a 6-year-old can manage, what it had felt like being asleep for so long. I wasn't really asleep the whole time, sweetheart, I told her. Just most of it. She thought about that for a moment, the way kids do, turning a strange idea over until it made sense to her. So were you sleeping? She asked. Or were you just waiting? I didn't have a quick answer for that one. I still don't. Not entirely. But I've thought about it more times than I can count since, and the closest I've come to the truth is this. There's a difference between the two, and it's a difference that can save your whole life if you understand it in time. Sleeping is what happens to you. Waiting is what you do on purpose, with your eyes closed and your ears wide open, until the exact moment the truth is ready to stand up in a room full of people and speak for itself. Renata came back to the plant once, nearly 2 years after the hearing, on an ordinary Tuesday afternoon, wearing a coat that wasn't new and hands that trembled slightly when she folded them in her lap across from my desk. Douglas's conviction had taken most of what remained of her reputation down with it. Nobody in Danvers wanted to hire the woman who'd almost helped bury her own husband alive in a hospital bed. She said she'd applied everywhere. She said she needed a job, any job, even in the front office, even answering phones. I looked at her for a long moment, the way I used to look across a kitchen table at a woman I'd loved for 9 years before I understood I'd never fully known her. You want to know something, Renata? I said finally. For 2 months I lay in that bed, pretending to be less aware than I was, watching everyone in my life show me exactly who they really were when they thought I couldn't see it. I learned more about trust in those 2 months than in the 61 years before them, and what I learned is that it's not a thing you can buy back with an apology, no matter how honest the apology is. It's a material like steel. Once it's been stressed past its limit, it doesn't go back to what it was, no matter how much weight you take off it afterward. So there's no chance, she said quietly, not even a small one. There's no version of this where I hand you the keys to anything again, I said. Not out of cruelty, out of the same thing that's kept this company standing for 31 years. I don't build with materials I already know will fail under pressure. She left without another word, and I sat alone in an office that still had my father's old drafting tools on the wall. In a company that had survived the worst thing anyone had ever tried to do to it, and I felt, for the first time since a nurse pressed a folded scrap of paper into my palm, completely, finally awake. 33 days is how long I spent, in total, letting the people closest to me believe I was gone. I've thought since about how strange it is that the most important thing I ever built wasn't a bridge or a steel frame or even the company that carries my name. It was a silence, held on purpose, long enough to let the truth finish building its own case before anyone had the chance to bury it for good.